What? How can I already be live? Hey, good day, everybody, and welcome to Rocky Mountain Readings, where yesterday we broke into a brand new book, Words That Hurt and Words That Heal, How the Words You Choose Shape Your Destiny by Rabbi Joseph Telushkin. A beautiful work so far. We got through quite a bit yesterday, and it's there on YouTube if you folks want to catch the beginning. I'm always glad to be joined by people all around the planet. I see we got Charles with us. Welcome, Charles. Shalom. And Ashley G. is always glad to have you with us, Ashley. This author's down your way, down in Los Angeles. So profound scholar for sure. So yeah, hopefully you folks are enjoying this so far. I got some calls last night and had to put out some fires, Noahide fires. There's always one thing or another, and life goes on. So today, folks, we're starting chapter 4. When, if ever, is it appropriate to reveal information that will humiliate or harm another? Okay. Jewish law compares spreading humiliating or harmful information to shedding blood, an act which is normally but not always wrong. And this has ramifications for B'nai Noach, because murder is considered not permissible according to B'nai Noach law. So if they look at it as humiliating another or harming another as shedding blood, it's got its thread of connection. And this is where the Noahide laws branch out into over 70 for sure halakha laws. So one specific case in which you are permitted to transmit negative truths is when you are asked for a business reference. As the Hafetz Chaim, the Eastern European rabbinic sage who was Judaism's preeminent authority on the laws of permitted and forbidden speech, he teaches, if a person wants to take someone into his affairs, for example, to hire him in his business or go into partnership with him, it is permitted for him to go around and ask and inquire from others so as to prevent possible loss to himself. And it is permissible for others to reveal even very derogatory information, since the intent is not to harm the prospective employee, but to tell the truth in order to save one's fellow human being from potential harm. Right, so you don't want to have a bankrupt, prone person in charge of your affairs, that's for sure. Similarly, Jewish law insists that you speak frankly when someone requests your opinion about a prospective employee whom you know to be dishonest or incompetent. Another instance in which it is permitted to reveal information is to someone who is romantically involved with a person whom you know is inappropriate, or if the boy or girlfriend is concealing information to which the partner is entitled. Wow, yeah, you don't want a line to get crossed there of sexual immorality, for sure. In an important overview of Jewish perspectives on privacy, Jewish legal scholar Rabbi Alfred S. Cohen tells of a young man whose friend was seriously dating his neighbor. The man knew that his friend had a health problem, but from conversation with the young woman, he realized that she was unaware of his condition. He asked Rabbi Cohen whether he should disclose this fact to her or whether this would constitute a violation of Judaism's laws forbidding gossip. The rabbi ruled that the Jewish law obliged the young man to pass on this information to the woman, since she had the right to know about her boyfriend's medical condition before deciding whether or not to marry him. But he noted there is no clear-cut moral or legal guideline about when to transmit such information. If the man went around telling every woman whom his friend dated about his illness, his friend's social life would be ruined. I think, especially if somebody's got an STD, you don't want to be involved in where transmission is harmful, as would their friendship. On the other hand, a woman who learns such information after she has gotten to know the man's more positive aspects will be in a far better position to judge the illness's significance for herself. I mean, if somebody's only got months to live, it's almost unfair to try to engage in such a thing. Morally, the best course would be for the young man to emphasize to his friend that he has a moral obligation to inform the woman himself, and even to tell him that if he doesn't do so, the friend will, only in a case where he won't tell the woman or where the relationship is clearly serious, should another person inform her. Presumably, the same advice would apply if you knew the person had been unfaithful in a previous marriage or possessed a very bad temper. Even in instances when you're permitted to share negative information, you should only reveal that which is relevant. Thus, if somebody inquires whether X would make a suitable business partner, you should say that X cheated on a previous partner, or that in a previous job, X came to work every day at 11 a.m. and went home at 3 p.m. You should not, however, dredge up a fascinating but irrelevant scandal involving X's marriage. When disclosing negative information, you should tell precisely what you know and nothing more. If you exaggerate, you are guilty of slander, and in such case, it would be morally preferable to say nothing at all. Oh, the drama people inject with exaggeration. You should also not disseminate embarrassing or negative information about X to anyone besides those who need it. Otherwise, moral people frequently violate this principle. They try to justify spreading negative news to large numbers of people by claiming that someone who hears such information might need it in the future. For example, everyone needs to know the reason so-and-so's marriage broke up. Not so, since someone who hears the story might someday date the person. Occasionally, it is morally appropriate to share negative information with many people. For example, if a political candidate has misused his office for personal profit, or if a physician is engaging in treatments that are harmful to patients. In such cases, some people will need this information, either to vote against the dishonest politician or to avoid harmful treatments by the unscrupulous doctor. The guiding principle for disseminating negative information is when the information's recipient will suffer from a clear and present danger, not necessarily a life-threatening one, if he or she doesn't possess these facts. As noted in Chapter 2, if you are uncertain that what you are passing along is definitely true, then you must say so. In such a case, you are permitted to warn an inquiring would-be business partner, employer, or mate to look into a specific matter, but you must explain that is what you heard said, or that is what you suspect. A simple guideline: if you would not be prepared to swear under oath that a story is true, don't present it as undeniably true. When, if ever, should confidences be broken? What about deep, dark secrets confided to a cleric or psychiatrist? Is it ever appropriate to reveal them? Here, the ethical standards of the world and of different religions vary. Consider an elementary or high school psychologist who learns that a student is using illegal drugs. Should the psychologist inform the child's parents? Over the years, I have posed this question before dozens of audiences. A large majority of listeners respond that the parents should be informed, since they know that I am a rabbi. When I asked them what they think Jewish law would rule, An even larger majority expresses the conviction that it would insist that parents be informed. In fact, it is likely that Jewish law would take the opposite view. As Rabbi Alfred Cohen argues, involving the parents might ultimately prove beneficial to the child, but the disclosure of confidential information might effectively stop other students from confiding in that psychologist and thereby prevent their being treated at all. Furthermore, if psychologists could not be trusted to maintain silence, people in general would stop using them. So the question really is, do psychologists benefit society as a whole? Will divulging secrets endanger the practice of that profession? What would be the net result to society if troubled persons no longer had someone to help them cope with personal problems? And I don't know about you, but we've seen this in my country specifically. There's been a lot of pullback of funding for psychiatric patients. And I remember when I was a young man, I worked in a drug and alcohol rehab center, and the city had shut down its psychiatric hospital. And for a lot of psychiatric people, it left them nowhere else to go, and they would just, come to the rehab center looking for, a place, and they always had a story, and you could tell they were visibly ill. And I'll never forget my second night on the job, somebody slashed their wrists who was psychiatric, and my second week, somebody hung themselves in the alley on my shift. Terrible scenario, but and this is why a lot of what the medical field protects its own self, and this is why it's illegal to practice medicine without a license. Even psychologists, if people didn't trust them, the whole field would go down, and the aid that they actually do for humanity wouldn't be out there, and the world would be in a darker place. This is a perfect example of the moral difficulties that ensue when an individual good clashes with societal good. And we see this even with the vaccines today. In this day and age, there's a lot of anti-vaxxers out there, and they don't realize that their position is a self-centered, me-first position. That's their individual good, and it's their choice, sure. But the position for the vaccinations, this is like a wildfire out of control. It's biological hazard protocol to use the strategy that implements containment and mitigation. So the efforts to contain it, to stop its spread is critical. That's societal good. But anti-vaxxers are all focused on the individual good, and it clashes with the societal good. And this is why you have the pullback of certain. It's not that they're removing people's rights. People have made that choice not to partake of those rights. All rights come with responsibility, and we have a delusion that thinks, nope, they're inalienable without responsibility, and that's not true. Yeah. Okay, in these specific cases, the rabbi suggests that the larger good of society constitutes a higher value than the possible benefit to one individual. And I'm going to highlight that for sure. On the other hand, if the psychiatrist had good reason to believe that the boy's survival depended on his parents knowing certain information, as in the case of a child contemplating suicide, ethics would dictate ruling differently. Yeah, if somebody's harmful to themselves or others, for sure. That needs to be known. And that's usually when people are given assessments. Consider the tragic case of Tatiana Tarasoff, a University of California at Berkeley student who was murdered by a man named Prosenjit Podar because she had rebuffed his romantic advances. After his arrest, it was revealed that Podar had confided to his psychologist, Dr. Lawrence Moore, his intentions to murder Tarasoff when she returned from her summer vacation. The psychologist had taken Podar's threat so seriously that he informed campus police, who in turn detained Podar for questioning. However, they released him when he appeared to be acting rationally. At that point, more superior Dr. Harvey Paulson directed him to desist from further action regarding the case, so that Moore never contacted Tarasoff to warn her about the danger. Unaware of what Podar had confided to his psychologist, the Tarasoff family maintained a cordial relationship with the spurned suitor. Podar even persuaded Tarasoff's brother to share an apartment with him and thus was in a position to learn when she returned from her vacation, at which time he murdered her. Tarasoff's parents successfully sued Doctors Moore and Paulson, as well as the University of California, for concealing life-threatening information from them. The majority of judges ruled that while doctor-patient confidentiality normally must be safeguarded, this privileged relationship should be breached when it puts an innocent person in serious danger. Yet even so commonsensical a conclusion provoked the ire of dissenting Justice William Clark, who argued that the doctor had acted appropriately in not contacting Tarasoff. Because of the majority ruling, he maintained patients henceforth would fear that information confided to therapists, including threats, might be disclosed, and thus treatment of the mentally ill would be greatly impaired. Even if one rejects Justice Clark's premise that it is preferable to sometimes let an innocent person die rather than violate a patient's confidence, the majority ruling in the Tarasoff case still leaves an open question. How can we reconcile our need to have outlets for unacceptable feelings with the need to protect the objects of those feelings? Since many people confide fantasies of violence against other people to their therapists, when should a mental health professional disclose these threats to a potential victim and to the people and to the police? Always? This would hardly be realistic because it probably goes on thousands of times a day globally. Or desirable. Most of us have probably exclaimed at some point in our lives, I could kill him. I really could. It is usually perfectly clear to both the listener and the speaker that the threat is not intended seriously. So if the therapist has good reasons to believe that the person is just venting his feelings, then clearly the patient-therapist's confidence should not be broken. Does this guideline place an unfair burden on the therapist, forcing her to decide case by case whether a threat is seriously intended? This is what comes with responsibility. Perhaps the best way to assess such threats is for the therapist to personalize them, to imagine that the violent sentiments are directed towards himself or toward a loved one. If the therapist feels no trepidation about the threat, then it is very likely, though not certainly, inconsequential. On the other hand, if the therapist feels fearful when personalizing the threat, knowing that she would tell her spouse and children, if you ever see this person come to the house, don't let him, her in. She should be morally obliged to inform the potential victim and the authorities. If personalizing a threat makes it seem more potent to the therapist, so be it. If an error must be made, better it should be made in the direction of saving an innocent life rather than safeguarding a would-be murderer's privacy. Yeah, and this question of privacy, and it comes up. Shalom, Sheila. Question of privacy comes up more and more, especially in our internet age day. You know, how much privacy and how much peering is and should be permitted, and what's the degree of threat with some of the devilish people on the internet out there. I mean, that's what a lot of organizations are devoted to. Are the ethics different in the case of clergy-client confidentiality? For example, there is a well-known Catholic canon law that prohibits revelations of any statements made in confession, even when a life is at stake. Not surprisingly, so uncompromising a position can lead to great moral difficulties. In Alfred Hitchcock's classic film, I Confess, a man confesses to a priest that he murdered someone, then plants circumstantial evidence implicating the cleric. Although the priest is aware of the killer's identity, he finds himself forbidden to disclose it to the police, even after he becomes the prime suspect, and even after an innocent woman's reputation is destroyed during a during a thorough and somewhat mean-spirited police investigation. A similar dilemma. Yeah, Charles, the anti-vaxxer is a controversial issue for sure. But that's my whole point, is that it's a look out for number one rather than look out for the greater good of people, Charles. That's the whole point that he pulled out, showing a clear difference of when threat happens to the public. And this is why I said that biological hazard protocol strategy mandates containment. And I've never heard an anti-vaxxer integrate containment. Most of them just talk as if it's not out there. There's no harm, and yet the death toll still climbs from the virus. It switches it tries to deflect the matter, and I realize a lot of anti-vaxxers are trying to quell fear and bring the fear level down, but that doesn't make the threat go away. You've got to treat a biohazard like a wildfire. You have to contain it and then mitigate it. And then, if possible, suppression of the cause becomes a later factor, so it doesn't spread again. And but please understand that all they're trying to do is contain. There's no serious threads of a massive plot up the food chain to the upper echelons of the ultra elite, like I've heard some anti-vaxxers, cite transhumanist agendas behind the scenes, and all kinds of theories of fear. And as I've said to those that are concerned about adverse effects of getting vaccinated, ask your doctor. There has been over 7 billion successful vaccines administered out there, and the stats were from the get-go. They realized that about 70 people per 100 million may have a side effect. 70 people per 100 million. When they looked at the question of containment, they said the risk was worth it. If we can vaccinate 100 million and only 70 people have a side effect, of course, they did not realize some of the side effects. And nobody wants anybody to suffer. But that's not exactly the issue. With the governments are working on containment of the virus. Containment. I've never heard an anti-vaxxer have anything to say on containment of the virus. Their attitude is look out for number one and pretend it doesn't exist out there and hope it goes away. Like I say, you got to deal with it like a wildfire, Charles. You got to, cut it off the fuel source and contain it in its spot so it doesn't spread. And this is just biohazard protocol strategy. And you can research, strategies for coping with certain things, and when dealing with that issue, they need to containment is a highest priority, or it'll spread like fire. And so you need to contain and then mitigate it. And yeah. Okay. A similar dilemma lies at the heart of Father William Kiesel's best-selling murder mystery, The Rosary Murders. Here, a serial killer confesses his crime to a priest and tells him the reason for his actions. Unlike his counterpart in I Confess, the priest doesn't know the anonymous confessor's identity, but he too knows that a Catholic law forbids him from informing the police about confession or any details he learned during it, lest this information enable them to identify the killer. After painful soul-searching, the thought of innocent people dying bothers him terribly. He concludes, should protecting the seal of confession cost a priest his life or another innocent life? No reason was sufficient, no cause important enough to violate the seal. And history has shown, like, there's one 60s murderer, serial killer, the Boston Strangler, 13 murders, and They had the confessor on tape, but the way it went down, no one was ever charged with those murders. And although they convicted the fellow who confessed on other charges, nobody was ever taken to court for the deaths of 13 people. Yet the confession tapes were there. But this is the way some backdoor deals happen in courts of law. Yeah. Jewish law is far less categorical. A test case of the principle of rabbi-client confidentiality occurred in New York in 1979 when a pregnant woman, Miriam D., was stabbed 14 times with a kitchen knife. She died. Her baby, whom the doctors tried to save, died 3 hours later. The murdered woman's husband later sought out a prominent rabbinic scholar and confessed to being haunted by his wife's death and by the thought that perhaps he might have stabbed her, though he was unaware whether the murder in his mind was real memory or a dream. And this was the same case with this Boston Strangler. He was deemed psychiatric with split personality disorder and literally having two minds in his one life. And yeah, there was a disconnect, and the doctors got involved, and ultimately nobody's held accountable. Well, that's a novel acronym there, Charles. But you know, the virus came out before the Democrats got into power, right? Subsequently to meeting with the husband of the murdered woman, and after reviewing the relevant Jewish sources, the rabbi went to the police. Their investigation revealed that the husband, who was deeply in debt and implicated in the murder of a diamond dealer, had taken out a large life insurance policy on his wife shortly before she was murdered. After the man was arrested, the rabbi testified as a prosecution witness at his trial. And in May 1980, the man was convicted of the murder of his wife. At the time, some members of the Jewish community felt that the rabbi had acted unjustly, that at the very least, he should have informed the killer that his disclosure would not be held in confidence. This objection seems unreasonable, given the man's violent nature and the rabbi's natural fear of the harm he might do to protect his terrible secret. Then, too, an important biblical principle states, do not stand by while your neighbor's blood is shed, from Leviticus 19, verse 16, which Jewish law understands as mandating that one not withhold help or information that can be of life and death significance to another. And that's something that anti-vaxxers, without containment in their approach, breach. I'm going to highlight that. Important as confidentiality is, it is a less compelling value than saving a person's life or bringing a killer to justice. While people generally have the right to expect a doctor, psychologist, clergy person, or lawyer to safeguard their secrets, this right is canceled when a higher good to the protection of innocent life is concerned. And this is why containment is needed, Charles, out there with this virus. And, we look forward to the day that it's under control and gone. And it's going downhill, the cases. It's still sad when it happens, but, it's kind of like the Titanic scenario. When the boat's going to sink, there's three kinds of people, and there are just those that absolutely freak out and lose their wit. There are those that bear down and deal with the situation, and there are those that pretend it doesn't exist. There's only those three kinds of people. And, you can't, you're culpable if you're just pretending it's not happening. There's nothing wrong, though, with a lot of anti-vaxxers that are promoting, healthy immune systems. You can't say anything negative about a healthy immune system. It's a positive for sure. Okay, privacy and public figures. Now, this is a whole different game. We see this with a lot of paparazzi questions. So far, we have discussed the rights of ordinary people to have their privacy respected. But what about public figures, especially those we have trusted to lead us? Are they a special case, or do we have the same ethical obligations toward them? Many journalists would consider public figures to be a special case. As Howard Simmons, former managing editor of the Washington Post and a prominent proponent of this view, puts it, I don't believe any politician in the United States ought to have a private life. Those who share this view argue that any activity in which a person engages can reveal significant information about his or her character. Thus, the voting public has the right to know it all. This belief is now so ingrained in the American psyche that many people rarely question on either moral or practical grounds the assertion that anyone who enters public life loses the right to protect himself from public scrutiny. Yes, is it moral to deny any human being, including a public official, a sphere of privacy in which she can act without fear that her actions will be reported to a large number of people? I would argue that the answer is no, that it is morally unjustifiable to deny public officials a private life. As Professor of Philosophy David Nyberg writes in the Varnished Truth, a life without privacy is unthinkable. How could we make love, reflect, or meditate, write a poem, keep a diary, attend to those sometimes highly self-conscious requirements of the skin and bowels? Civility itself requires privacy. To deny public figures privacy is to deny them both intimate relationships, which in large measure defined by the sharing of information that is not shared with others, and an internal life. And, I say to the American people out there, if you take this approach that there's no privacy for the elected people because they're public figures, that trickles down. And if you treat them as though they have no right to privacy, they're going to in turn mirror that back to the populace, and you don't want that. You find somebody who's always under scrutiny is somebody who seems to walk on eggshells, and that's one thing I hate to do. Is I tell people that are like that, don't try and put me on eggshells, because all you're going to hear is crunch, 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 and that's just who I am. I try to be bold, and I don't believe in that kind of tyranny that people try to lord over another. It's just not right. But this is what privacy is necessary, though it's harder and harder to find in these day and age. But don't such no-holds-barred investigations lead voters to select better qualified, more ethical candidates? Isn't the evil of even intrusive snooping therefore outweighed by a greater good? Again, I would answer no. 20 years of muckraking, much of it centered on candidates' private lives, certainly hasn't led to the election of more capable or more honest people. I think we can agree on that, right, Charles? Its primary achievement has been to make Americans more cynical and less trusting than ever of their elected leaders. One feature that characterizes what political scientist Larry Sabato labels attack journalism, and this is why President Trump was one to use the phrase fake news, because it was attack journalism, is extensive coverage of public figures' sexual indiscretions, a subject that arouses the greatest amount of popular and journalistic obsession, tabloid stuff. Yet no evidence suggests that presidents or other public officials or opinion makers who have cheated on their spouses have proven less effective or, and this is more significant, less trustworthy than presidents who have been faithful. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, for example, is widely viewed as the greatest American president of the 20th century. Yet Roosevelt had a far from satisfactory sex life with his wife Eleanor and entered into a lengthy affair with one of his assistants, Lucy Mercer, who was with him when he died. Despite this character flaw, Roosevelt was an effective president who accomplished much good. One would be hard put to show that whatever flaws he had as a chief executive were a result of extramarital relationships. Had his adultery been publicized, he probably would not have been reelected. Would that have been better or worse for the American people? Compare Roosevelt with Richard Nixon, who apparently was totally faithful to his wife throughout their marriage. Despite his admirable marital monogamy, Nixon remains the only American president forced to resign from office. In his private life, Nixon may well have been a virtuous monogamist, but that proved to be no guarantee of character in other respects. Oh, humanity's so diverse. Downplaying a president's marital infidelity does not mean that the country's good is more significant than any presidential character failings, but rather that such moral shortcomings should be made public knowledge only if they relate to the job for which the individual is running. Like, you don't want to put somebody who's known to be a thief running the finances. If Roosevelt had been guilty of stealing government funds, that would have been a betrayal of his office, something that the public had a need and right to know. But his private sexual behavior had nothing to do with his performance as president. In short, negative information that is related to the person's job performance should be made known. Negative information that is related to job performance, that is unrelated to job performance, should not. But what about John F. Kennedy, whose extramarital indiscretions were far more widespread than Roosevelt's? Is there more reason to believe that his behavior affected his presidential performance? The evidence suggests not. Of course, if Kennedy had been public about his adultery, insisting that it was his right to flaunt the breaking of his marital vows, that would have been a different matter. Similarly, if during Kennedy's presidential tenure, his critics had maintained that he seemed to be a lazy chief executive or was often unavailable to carry out his responsibilities, one could make the case that his sexual philandering interfered with his job performance, and that the public would have had the right to know about it. But such criticism of Kennedy was never offered. On the contrary, he was constantly depicted as exceptionally energetic. There appears to be no reason why the public had to know about his sexual behavior. There is one instance, however, where Kennedy's sexual activities should have been revealed. Before and while he was president, he had an affair with Judith Exner, who was simultaneously the mistress of Sam Giancana, the boss of the Chicago mob. There is strong circumstantial evidence to suggest that she served as a courier between the two men. As columnist William Safire has written, the private life of any public figure is nobody's business but his own. But when the nation's chief executive receives even a few calls from the home telephone of the leader of the mafia in Chicago, that crosses the line into the public's business. Makes sense? Even in this case, the significance for the public was not Kennedy's acts of adultery per se, but the indirect relationship he thereby established with the mafia boss. Thus, it equally would have been the public's right to know of this connection had Exner been a close male friend of both Kennedy and Giancana. Finally, consider Martin Luther King Jr., the only American whose birthday has been turned into a national holiday during this last century. Reverend King was a leading figure in the civil rights movement, which led to the end of legalized segregation. You got to remember, too, legalized segregation, that was a clear example of how some solutions, or today's solution, becomes tomorrow's problem. You know, this was based on the 1919 race riots that happened near Chicago, and they to prevent the riots, they actually segregated the people. It was no longer lawful for the color to mix with the Caucasian. And you got to remember that was legalized. And uh, you need to understand that sometimes today's solution can become tomorrow's problem. It doesn't justify making bad errors, but um, it should help people to understand that you know problems of yesterday were completely unique, and I just don't agree. Like where some people have been tearing down statues of leaders from the 1700s because they might have been a slave owner or something. That was just the sign of the times. That's like trying to ask somebody today if they've ever been on the internet. I mean, it's almost unheard of that somebody has never been on the internet in our day and age. Okay, speaking of Reverend King, he was also a spiritual leader par excellence, whose I Have a Dream speech delivered during the 1963 March on Washington remains one of the century's most powerful inspirational assertions of human dignity. Yet Reverend King's illicit liaisons became widely known after his death in 1968 through the activities of one of the most compulsive snoopers and disseminators of negative truths and untrue rumors in American history. J. Edgar Hoover, the longtime head of the FBI, Hoover, who had little affection or respect for blacks, placed a tap in hotel rooms where King was staying and learned of his amorous liaisons. How could broadcasting such information to the public possibly have been in the interest of national security? What possible greater moral good, greater than our defeat of Jim Crow and jogging the nation's conscience, would have been served? Although adultery is a serious sin, the evidence seems to show that not only can one be simultaneously a good president and an adulterer, and one can even be a great moral leader, as in the case of Dr. King, and engage in extramarital sex. I wouldn't condone it, but I'm, of course, not advocating this, he says. Great. An essayist, Dennis Prager, has argued recent history would show that men who have committed adultery were more likely to be great leaders than men who have always been faithful. Now, of course, Prager concedes such a conclusion is absurd, but it is no more absurd than concluding that men who have committed adultery are less likely to be good leaders. Americans have paid a steep price for the media's ongoing obsession with sexual gossip. Most important, it has caused media and hence public attention to focus on a personal rather than substantive issue. Reporter Stephen Roberts has observed that more ink was devoted to Wilbur Mills' exploits with Fannie Fox, a stripper with whom the congressman had an affair, than to Wilbur Mills writing half the tax laws on the books. Does that serve the readers and make sense? Not to me. While Roberts is correct that this makes no logical sense, the reason for the media's oddly skewed priorities is clear to anyone who understands human nature. Most of us are very interested in others' failings, particularly their sexual peccadillos, even when we acknowledge that such curiosity is intrusive, uncouth, and even immoral. It is difficult to suppress it. Let's say you were in a friend's house, walked into the bedroom, and found your friend's diary open. The first words you saw there, I had sex yesterday with ... Would you have the moral strength and character to close the book? Over the years, I've asked dozens of audiences, how many of you think that the public had a right to know about presidential candidate Gary Hart's 1987 affair with Donna Rice, the Miami Herald's revelation of which caused the then Colorado senator to withdraw from the 1988 presidential race? Regularly, between 10 and 20% say yes, while well over 60% say no. And that's because, privacy question. When you breach the wall, it's like a dam. If you poke a hole in it, it can grow. and the floodwaters come in. If you say it should be made public, you are granting the powers that be the opportunity to go again, break down your privacy. Yes, Charles. Hey, but this is the first time I've ever heard that he. It was known that he had sexual immorality going on. That's the first time I've ever heard that. I've always looked at Martin Luther King Jr. as a highly respected. I've looked at a lot of the injustice coming out of the lawful segregation, and grown up in that era of transition. And I grew up in southern Ontario near Niagara, not too far from Niagara Falls, and we had a lot of black folks come up from the United States into Canada. The point being is that the integration to us was not viewed the same as down there. There was never any lawful segregation up here that was in the United States, and you know. Yeah, I always looked at Martin Luther King Jr. as a highly respectable, honorable figure, but that's the first time I've ever heard that it was known that he had sexual immorality in his yeah. Okay, I address my next question only to the no majority as an outgrowth of your belief that the public had no right to this knowledge. How many of you refused to read articles about Hart's affair and turned off your television sets when it was announced that pictures were now going to be shown of the woman with whom Hart had his affair? Almost everyone laughs at this question, and at most one or two hands go up. Those who believe that the public had no moral right to know about Gary Hart's affair, but who followed the case avidly, are not hypocrites. They are human beings with normal human interests. Almost all negative gossip, particularly about sex, is so inherently interesting that it is very hard to ignore. To draw an analogy, most married Americans believe in monogamy. But if every time they checked into a hotel, a very attractive member of the opposite sex were waiting for them in their rooms, a great many confirmed monogamists would commit adultery. Mercifully, few of us have such temptations. Beyond criminal abrogations of duty, such as embezzling funds or the like, the chief offenses for which public officials deserve to be called to account is hypocrisy. For example, does the person engage in conduct he denounces or wishes to see punished in others? Even here, however, caution is advised. A few years back, a friend of mine whose husband holds a high public office called me for advice about an ethical dilemma. She and her husband had learned that a prominent adversary of her husband's political party once conducted an adulterous affair. His mistress had become pregnant, and the man urged her to have an abortion. She did, and he paid for it. Both of us knew that revealing such information would definitely end the man's political career, given that he had carefully cultivated an image of great moral rectitude. I asked my friend only one question. Does this man currently oppose the right of women to have abortions? If yes, his hypocrisy in arranging an abortion when it suited his interests would be so clear that it seemed to me that this information should be released. But if he supported a woman's right to have an abortion, I believe that outing him for having committed adultery would be immoral. The man's relationship with his wife was intact, and the woman with whom he had an affair had gone on with her life. It was only by the strangest of coincidences that this information had come to my friend's hands. Why destroy a person and humiliate his or her family for committing an act that is nobody else's business? Yeah, and there's nothing more. And this is what we see, like in the book of Job, where the Satan tries to open up the books and expose the scenario over and over. And there's nothing more wicked than trying to paint with a dirty brush somebody else. It's unethical, and it humiliates and harms. So seeing it for what it is. My friend acknowledged that the adversary supported abortion rights, but cited other politicians' stances with which she disagreed, positions on which I concurred with her. However, I maintained that it would be indefensible to reveal his infidelity and the abortion. Much as we dislike somebody, to dig up and disseminate whatever dirt we can or to destroy him or her would still be wrong. In short, public figures should not be exempt from the rights of privacy that we all enjoy. That's a key point. Except for those aspects of their lives that relate to their job performance. They should be able to keep their private lives private. Ironically, the obsession with invading our leaders' private lives has not even achieved the one good one might expect, a deeper knowledge of those whose lives have been investigated, because candidates are aware that the media treat them like arrested felons. Anything you say can be used against you. Many confine themselves to banalities when speaking in the presence of journalists. They not inappropriately assume that it's safer to appear bland than to risk making a personal revelation or a statement that can be cited out of context and used to damn them in the future. And since I've been doing this on no-hide social media, it's pretty shocking. I've seen so many things taken out of context for people that would jump on another person. They're just like predators, like frogs with wicked tongues trying to reach out and grab flies. They're searching for drama. Finally, it's likely that such intrusive scrutiny discourages many Americans, some with fine characters, from considering public service. How many among us, if nominated to a political position that would provoke our ideological opponents to ask everyone who has known us, tell us the worst thing you know about so-and-so, or the worst thing you have ever heard about him. Tell us the names of anybody you know who dislikes him, so we can speak to them, would willingly undergo such scrutiny, however moral our lives. Even journalists bent on exposing the feet of clay in every public figure's shoes do not wish to sustain such an indignity. In 1987, Paul Taylor, a Washington Post reporter, asked presidential candidate Gary Hart whether he thought that adultery was immoral. When Hart said yes, Taylor asked him if he had committed adultery. After a moment's stammering, Hart responded, "I don't have to answer that." A few weeks later, after Hart had withdrawn from the presidential campaign, People magazine posed to Taylor the same two questions he had addressed to Hart. "Yes, I do consider adultery immoral," the journalist responded. "The answer to the second question is none of your business." In other words, even those who spread gossip don't want to be its victims. The time has come to return to some of the civility that prevailed in the past. Perhaps the worst repercussion of attack journalism is that some decent people, precisely because they are more easily ashamed, have been and will be discouraged from entering the public arena. New York Times columnist Anthony Lewis seems correct in arguing that if we tell people there's to be absolutely nothing private left to them, then we will tend to attract to public office only those most brazen, least sensitive personalities. Surely such an outcome serves no moral good. And that's a very, very, very good point in the end of that chapter, for sure. Part 3, how we speak to others. Hopefully you folks are enjoying this. How we speak to others. Controlling rage and anger. And I know so many people that can benefit this, and I'm sure I won't, I can benefit from reading this as well. Only God can give us credit for the angry words we did not speak. That's by Rabbi Harold Kushner. When all you've ever wanted isn't enough. The Bible almost always describes romantic love from the male perspective. We are told that Isaac loved Rebekah in Genesis 24:67, Jacob loved Rachel in Genesis 29:18, and Samson loved Delilah from Judges 16:4. In the entire Bible, there is only one woman whose love for a man is recorded. Now, Michal, daughter of King Saul, had fallen in love with David. 1 Samuel 18, verse 20. A short time later, when Michael's father, afraid that David would usurp the throne, plotted to kill him. She helped David escape by lowering him from a window. She then confused the hired assassins by placing a human image topped with hair and dressed in the clothes in David's bed in 1 Samuel 19:11-17. By the time the would-be killers realized Michal's ruse, her beloved was far away. Although the Bible never reports that David reciprocated her love, we do know that he risked his life in one-on-one battle with 200 Philistines to win Michal's hand in marriage from 1 Samuel 18:25-29. Later, when David spent years hiding from King Saul, Saul married off Michal, still David's wife, to a man named Faulty. Although many husbands would have repudiated a wife who had acquiesced to such an arrangement, when David became king, he restored Michal as his queen. Yet despite the intense love at their relationship's outset, David and Michal's marriage becomes perhaps the saddest in the Bible. And within a few years, this once devoted couple were totally estranged. David and Michal both suffered from the same character flaw, a sharp tongue, which they refused to control when angry. The Bible describes the incident that triggered the end of their love. Ironically, it was a celebration. David was supervising the return to Jerusalem of the Ark of the Lord, the holiest object in ancient Jewish life, which the Philistines had captured many years earlier. In an outburst of joy, he danced passionately, even wildly, in front of thousands of his subjects. Watching the whole scene from a palace window, Michal was disgusted by the spectacle of a monarch carrying on with such abandon. And so when David returned to the palace, she greeted him with cold sarcasm. Didn't the king of Israel do himself honor today, exposing himself as one of the riffraff might expose himself? From 2 Samuel 6:20. Were Michal's withering remarks justified? Had David truly acted in a manner that diminished the dignity of his office? Perhaps, but whether or not Michal was right, her tactless criticism of her husband on this great day in his life blew a dispute into a gale-force fury. Michal's attack, however, was only the first factor in the tragedy that ensued. In the face of his wife's scorn, David did not remain silent, walk away until the tension eased, or even try to defend his behavior. Instead, he responded with the cruelest counterattack he could muster. It was before the Lord who chose me instead of your father and all his family that I danced. Whoa. David's words in no way address the substance of Michal's critique, as many of us do when criticized. He went straight for blood, attacking the most painful event in Michal's life, God's rejection of her father and his subsequent death, along with 3 of Michal's brothers at the hands of the Philistines. In the very next verse, the Bible records, so to her dying day, Michal, daughter of Saul, had no children. Why is Michal's childlessness recorded at this point? Perhaps because after so brutal an exchange, and there might well have been others, Michal and David were never again intimate. The Bible's point is as clear today as it was in 1000 BCE. If a husband or wife or 2 siblings or friends do not restrain their words when they are angry, love is unlikely to survive, no matter how deeply the 2 people once cared for each other. Interesting. The ability to control what we say when we're angry is a prerequisite for lasting relationship. That's a very, very, very big point. The ability to control what we say when we're angry is a prerequisite for a lasting relationship. I've been in relationships in the past, where people just want to push that button, They want you riled up and angry, and then they want to test it. That's terrible behavior. Unfortunately, this piece of biblical wisdom flies in the face of much modern thinking. Today, many people believe that it's unhealthy to suppress rage. If you feel an emotion, it's considered important that you say exactly what you're feeling. This sort of pop psychology assertion can be deflated with a one-word question. Why? What? That you feel rage does not entitle you to inflict emotional pain on others any more than feelings of sexual attraction entitle you to rape the source of your attraction. And that's the case of it. It's, rage is it's self-idolatry. Okay, you need to understand that rage is in the line of the against the prohibition of idolatry. It's like a child stamping its feet. I want my way, and that's what rage is. It's self-worship. It's self-idolatry. Takes your eyes off of Hashem and only focuses on what you want, and when you're not getting it, and yeah, it's self-worship is what it is. Understand that clearly and how it links with the prohibition of idolatry. One should not ever consider Some might argue that, unlike rape, rage is justifiable. Then again, what angry person doesn't feel that his or her rage is justified? One of anger's insidious qualities is that one can find 1,000 excuses for it. And while rage sometimes is justified, what other emotions should one feel toward an Adolf Eichmann or a Charles Manson? Many of us express it when only far milder emotions are warranted. As psychotherapist Bernie Zilderberg has written, I cannot count the number of times that married couples tell me, I've got all this anger bottled up and I need to get it out. Sure you do, and I'll be happy to cater the divorce. It's usually divorce happens when people would rather be right than together. They've justified themselves into a corner that they're right, and they'd rather own that than be together. Even when anger is justified, all that it justifies is expressing anger proportionate to the provocation. That's kind of a... I'm going to highlight that. If it's disproportionate, it is unfair, unjust, and hence morally wrong. So what if you find it painful to hold in your angry feelings? Isn't it morally preferable that you experience the pain of suppressing your anger than the person with whom you're angry experiencing the pain of on the receiving end? Rage, however, is not only destructive, as in the case of David and Michal, but also self-destructive. The rabbis claim that when a wise man loses control of his temper, his wisdom deserts him. It just leaves him. Thus, the book of Numbers describes an episode in which Moses becomes outraged at the Israelites' incessant whining about water. God directs him to speak to a large rock from which he will then send water to satisfy the people's thirst. But Moses, still furious at the Israelites' many years of complaining, disobeys Hashem's command. Instead of speaking to the rock, Moses strikes it, saying, "Listen, you rebels, shall we get water for you out of this rock?" From Numbers 20, verse 10. Many of us hit objects when angry. The Torah's point is profound. When angry, you should attempt to speak, not hit or burst out in rage. Furthermore, during anger, we are apt to make extreme and unwise comments. Thus, although Moses surely did not intend it, the we implied that it was he and Aaron, not Hashem, who were responsible for the miracle of the water gushing forth from the rock. This was dangerously foolish comment, the kind we all make when angry, which could have led the Israelites to believe that Moses himself was doing it. Moses paid dearly for his loss of self-control. Hashem denied him entry into the promised land. In addition to acting unwisely, losing our temper often makes us appear foolish. In his book, Acting in Film, actor Michael Caine recalls that I used to lose my temper. I would fly off the handle quite quickly in a work situation. Then I worked on a picture called The Last Valley by James Clavell, who had been a prisoner of the Japanese during World War II. James looks like an Englishman, but he really thinks like a Japanese. I lost my temper one day, and James just took me and let me finish ranting and raving, and then he said, "Come with me, Mike. Let's go round the corner and sit down." He sat me down and talked to me about the Japanese theory of losing face. If you start to scream and shout, you look like a fool, and you feel like a fool, and you earn the disrespect of everyone. I've never lost my temper in a work situation again. A close friend of my wife, a man who has long struggled with temper, once put it, haven't you learned already that when you lose control of your temper, you look deranged? So it is important to control our rage, however righteous it may be. And this is it. Righteous indignation is what people want to, justify their rage to. That's where they're aiming. They want to, squash or do something, and they want to be righteous in doing it, and such pomp. Human beings may well have little control over what provokes their anger. We can't stop it from coming our way. But all of us, unless we are under the influence of mind-altering drugs or suffer some mental illness or have certain types of brain damage, usually can control how we express our anger. Psychologist Richard Gels tells of a marriage counselor who was interviewing a man who often physically abused his wife. "Why do you beat up your wife?" the counselor asked the husband. "I can't control myself," the man responded. "I just lose control." The counselor, being a very wise person, asked, "Well, why don't you shoot her or stab her?" The husband had no response to that because the only answer he could have given would be, "I can't shoot or stab my wife. I might permanently hurt her." This man knew very well what he was doing. If you believe that you truly can't control your temper, imagine the following scenario. You and another person, say a family member, are having a screaming, no-holds-barred fight when suddenly the doorbell rings. Someone whom you're very eager to impress, say a boss or a new client, stands in front of the door. Would you go on ranting, or would you find a way to suppress your rage? Perhaps you would suppress your rage for a short while, for as long as it took the visitor to leave, whereupon the fight would erupt again. But even if that happens, your ability to delay the rage means that you do have some control over your temper. Furthermore, the delay itself would likely lessen the fight's intensity. As psychologist Carol Tavares cautions, expressing anger while you feel most angry nearly always makes you angrier. I would go a step further. I believe that most of us can control the expression of anger for far longer than a few minutes or even hours. Here's another situation. Suppose you were told that if you cut back on screaming at your spouse or children, friends, or employees by 75% during an entire year, you would be given $2 million. Do you think you would find a way to control your temper? Obviously, we have more control over our rage than we are willing to acknowledge. For some, the control might be almost total. For others, it might be far less. People who have less control must recognize the moral obligation to curb their harsh words. If they find themselves incapable of doing so on their own, they are morally obligated to seek the sort of professional help that will enable them to exert greater self-control. Each year, large numbers of once loving relationships worth far more than $2 million are destroyed because of the hateful things people say when angry. To counter this, we must destroy the myth that Michal and David and you and I cannot control what we say or do. Dr. Stephen Marmer, a psychiatrist, recommends that in dealing with anger, we should think in terms of layers or cascades of control. Control of our initial reaction, control of our initial response, control of our initial reaction to others' response, and control of our succeeding reactions. These are huge. Moving down this list, the degree of control grows progressively greater. Thus, even if you have not controlled your initial response, you can exert greater control over your next response and work to repair any damage you might have caused earlier. Indeed, one of the saddest things about the David Michal story is that the Bible records no effort by either to repair the damage caused by their tactless and cruel words. This is not to say that it is wrong to feel anger or to express it within ethical limits. When Maimonides, the Rambam, perhaps the greatest Jewish philosopher, wrote on the need to control one's temper, he also warned that a person should not become so indifferent to what others do that he becomes like a corpse, totally incapable of feeling. This is a danger for sure. Maimonides' cautionary words might well have been in response to the extreme strictures expressed by some Roman thinkers against ever expressing anger. But indolence is what Maimonides was trying to, the dangers of being indolence. He used the old Latin phrase indolentum in the case of what it does to the mind and the soul. Profound. Seneca, the first century Stoic philosopher, argued that people could control their tempers no matter what the provocation. He cited the story of Harpagus, who, instead of going into a rage when a Persian king presented him with the heads and flesh of his own children, responded bloodlessly at the king's board, "Any kind of food is delightful." What Maimonides proposes, instead of emotional golden mean, okay, a person should display anger only when the matter is serious enough to warrant it, in order to prevent the matter from recurring. In this regard, he might well have been influenced by the nuanced advice of Aristotle, of whom Maimonides was a lifelong student. It is a slavish nature that will submit to being insulted or let friends be insulted unresistingly. A person is praised who is angry for the right reasons, with the right people, and also in the right way, at the right time, and for the right length of time. In other words, there is nothing wrong with feeling anger and with expressing it within certain prescribed and ethical limits. So, yeah, Maimonides was just wonderful at clarifying it and where it sat on the scale of the golden mean, and the dangers of going too far in one direction or another. If you ever ruptured a close relationship with angry words, consider whether observing the following rule could have led to a different outcome. Limit the expression of your anger to the incident that provoked it only. Focusing the discussion in this way enables the criticized party to feel that his or her whole being isn't being attacked. It was this principle that David violated in his cruel counterattack after Michal mocked his dancing. He could have responded in many different ways. "It hurts me that you attack me on this incredible day. I was overcome with joy and I didn't control my dancing because I didn't want to." Or, "I wish you'd give up your aristocratic ideas of how a king must act and realize how wrong you are. I made myself more, not less, beloved in the eyes of the people by showing them that I am a creature of the flesh and blood just like them." He could have spoken more sharply. "You are the one who acted wrongly, Michal, by remaining in the palace and acting coldly and indifferently on so great a day." However, what David did wrong was to attack Michal at her point of greatest vulnerability. It was before the Lord who chose me instead of your father and all his family, that I danced. These words were calculated to humiliate and devastate his wife. They were the equivalent of responding to a slap in the face with a shot to the heart. Unfortunately, many people act as David did. In Somerset, Moms of Human Bondage, the protagonist, Philip, has a club foot. One reason for Philip's generally low estimation of human nature is the realization that when his fellows were angry with him, they never failed to taunt him with his deformity. We all have club feet. In Michael's case, it was the pain of her father's rejection by Hashem. For someone else, it could be a weight problem or the lack of professional success or an unhappy love life. To bring another person's vulnerability into an argument is wrong, not maybe wrong, not sometimes wrong, but absolutely wrong. If you ever become tempted to attack someone where he or she is most vulnerable, stop yourself from doing it, as surely as you would stop yourself from punching a friend at whom you were upset. The worst time possible to allude to painful areas in another person's life is during a fight. You are likely to be much harsher and the other person far less receptive if he thinks your comments are part of an attack. If sore points must be discussed, do so when you are feeling love for the person, not animosity. Had David and Michal abided by this rule, they could have fought about the issue that provoked their anger, but their dignity and hence their relationship could have remained intact. The flip side of expressing disproportionate anger is not expressing it at all. Many of us, when injured, tend to withdraw from the person who has hurt us rather than address the issue. This withdrawal violates the biblical injunction, do not hate your brother in your heart, from Leviticus 19:17. When we learned this law as yeshiva students, my classmates and I found it unintentionally amusing. Does that mean one boy challenged our teacher that it's all right to hate somebody as long as you tell them to their face? More or less, the rabbi answered, to our surprise. Of course, it would be better if you didn't hate somebody, but when you're angry at a person, you should confront him or her. Otherwise, your anger will fester and grow. By way of example, the teacher cited the biblical story of two half-brothers, Amnon and Absalom, who were sons of King David, in one of the Bible's unhappiest episodes. Amnon rapes and then abandons Absalom's sister, Tamar, who is Amnon's half-sister. Afterward, Absalom never confronts his brother, and Absalom spoke to Amnon neither good nor evil, for Absalom hated Amnon. 2 Samuel 13:22. Ultimately, after 2 years have passed, he arranges to have Amnon murdered. Whether or not Amnon deserved to die is besides the point. The teacher told us, rather, we should note the Bible's words. And Absalom spoke to Amnon neither good nor evil, for Absalom hated Amnon. The rabbis deduced from this that a person who remains unnaturally silent when an expression of anger is called for might later explode into a murderous rage. Yeah, usually the most dangerous, those that don't talk about it, are usually the ones that'll do it. Of course, most of us suffer much less grievous provocations, and rather than overreacting to them by killing someone, we nurse our injuries in silence, talk about them to people who cannot help, or inflict our anger on innocent people. As psychologist Carol Tavris has written, if you are angry at Ludwig, all the discussions in the world with your best friend will not solve the problem. Unless the discussion results in your changing your perception of Ludwig, oh, I hadn't realized that he didn't mean to insult me. It is likely to reinforce your own interpretations, with the result that you rehearse your anger rather than ridding yourself of it. If you displace your anger by punching pillows, conjuring up vengeful scenarios, telling nasty jokes, or hitting your child, your anger will not be diminished, nor will the displacement be cathartic. This is because the cause of your anger remains unchanged. When you are angry, remember that there will always be time to break irrevocably with your antagonist. Sharing your anger with many people might prematurely cause such a break. If you do speak about the matter with others, choose people who might calm you down and help you see things in a broader, less bitter perspective. Avoid those who could provoke your rage. He said that to you? That's disgusting. What are you going to do about it? But most importantly, try to speak to the person with whom you are angry. Focusing on the object of the anger also underscores the importance of direct communication between antagonistic parties. A rabbi I know in Los Angeles received a letter from a congregant who was unhappy about a certain development in the synagogue. The rabbi knew that the policy that had offended the correspondent had been established well before his arrival at the synagogue as the synagogue spiritual leader. He showed the letter to the synagogue's president, who told him that he would personally draft a response and explain the policy to the unhappy congregant. There the matter ended, so the rabbi thought. Sometime later, the synagogue again received a letter from the congregant who explained that since the rabbi hadn't responded to his letter, he felt that he had no spiritual leader in the congregation and was resigning his membership. He also noted that when the congregation engaged a new rabbi, he would be willing to rejoin. In addition to asking that this letter be shared with the whole board, he sent the rabbi a copy. The rabbi described to me his reaction when he read the congregant's letter. All sorts of angry thoughts ran through my mind. I felt like writing him, "I'm sorry that I drove as kind as man as you to write such ugly things. Furthermore, your need to suggest that my dying, resigning, or being fired would prompt your return to the synagogue was gratuitously nasty." Of course, he wrote no such thing. Upset though he was, he wisely read the congregant's letter to a fellow rabbi. When he finished, his colleague offered a surprising response. The way this man phrased his letter was definitely angering, but with all due respect, you are not fully in the right either. The letter was addressed to you, and seeing how upset he was, you should have responded, if only to tell him that he would be hearing from the president. The rabbi swallowed hard and remained silent for a while. "You're right," he finally said to his colleague. "Well, if the right is not all on my side, then why am I feeling so annoyed at this man?" He thought about this question a while longer and finally realized that had the complainant written him a second time, telling him how upset he was not to have received a response to his letter, he would have felt terrible. He would have been horrified to realize that he had hurt someone deeply and would immediately have called or written the man. Instead, the congregant had never informed him of his hurt and anger. Rather, he had shared his angry feelings with the rabbi's employers, the synagogue's board of directors, hoping thereby to inflame other people against him and to bring about his dismissal. Instead of being able to think clearly about the possible legitimacy of the man's critique, the rabbi responded with fury. The moral: always address your grievances to their source. Much wisdom still inheres in William Blake's old quatrain. I was angry with my friend, I told my wrath did end. I was angry with my foe, I told it not, my wrath did grow. Wow, what a statement. You know what? I think at this stage I'm gonna stop for today, and we'll come back tomorrow with chapter 7, which is fighting fair. So I think we've covered a lot today. That especially the controlling of anger and how to cope with it and overcome it for sure, and quell it, and when the need is there to not just break things off and become indolent, because it will allow the anger to fester. You got to get rid of it, not just get it out. You got to get rid of it. And you need to see how it harms your very soul. But you also don't want to be a person that is led by provocation out there, because you can't control the things that come your way. And if it's a character flaw or trait and Hashem's got the book open, he may just permit the Satan to bring about every little thing you do, left or right. You're going to get battered with provocation after provocation after provocation, to be taught how to overcome it. So heaven forbid that ever happened to anyone. And yet it does. If you want to cleave to Hashem and draw close to Hashem, sometimes your character has to develop and grow. And I hope that each and every one of you are learning something along the way with each and every reading we do here. It's a joy to me and an opportunity to be able to share with such wonderful people, get to know such wonderful people that are truly God-fearing and want to grow and develop in godliness and in righteousness, and make the world a better place. And I hope you all learn things from these readings that empower you to make the world a better place, and you can put it into practice. Or if a scenario ever comes up and you remember an answer, boom, you know how to cope with it. And I'm enjoying this work. Is decent. I still of late that Nefesh Chachaim was one of my favorites, and since we've started reading, beautiful work by Rav Chaim of Volozhin. Wonderful series. Anyways, this is a beautiful book that was highly rated as well, as I showed yesterday. Let's break it off for today, and we'll be back tomorrow with Rocky Mountain Readings. We'll continue the wonderful book, Words That Hurt and Words That Heal, and also how it shapes your destiny. I think Rabbi Telushkin's done a beautiful job with this so far, and I'm sure there's going to be great stuff upcoming. We're only about a third through the book. So please come back tomorrow and we'll go from there. Have a wonderful, wonderful day, everybody. Bye for now.